The cabin had that smell of old wood and pine needles the moment we walked in. Mark had promised us a real weekend escape, and I'll admit, when I first stepped into that place with its stone fireplace and creaky floorboards, I believed him. There were 5 of us: Mark, his girlfriend Hannah, our friend Tyler, my roommate Eric, and me. We lugged in bags of groceries, argued about who got which bunk, and lit the first fire before midnight. It was warm, loud, filled with laughter. I told myself that was all the weekend would be: noise, food, and card games. Just what I needed. Then came the knock. It was almost midnight. At first, we thought it was just the wind against the shutters. But the knock came again, steady this time, unmistakable. We froze, glancing around at each other. Nobody had said anything about expecting someone. Mark got up, frowning, and pulled open the heavy front door. "Uncle James," he said, his surprise melting into a grin. The man standing there was tall, shoulders squared under a dark jacket, hair damp from the mountain air. His presence filled the doorway in a way that immediately quieted us all. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, and his eyes, sharp, steady, swept across the room before settling briefly but unmistakably on me. "Didn't think you'd actually make it," Mark said, stepping aside. James shifted the small duffel bag in his hand. "Plans changed. Thought I'd stop by for a day or two." He didn't speak loudly, but the way he carried himself made people listen anyway. He wasn't like Mark, who had always been larger than life, filling silence with chatter. James was different. Measured, quiet, the kind of presence you didn't notice until you couldn't ignore it anymore. "Guys, this is my Uncle James," Mark said quickly, gesturing around. "Uncle James, this is Hannah, Tyler, Eric, and this is—" Our eyes met again when he said my name. He gave me a firm handshake, his palm rough, warm, lingering just long enough for me to notice before he let go. Introductions moved on, the noise picked up again, and soon everyone was focused back on the card games spread across the coffee table. But I couldn't quite relax. I kept catching myself aware of him, sitting in the armchair by the fire, jacket off now, watching the flames. Every once in a while, I swore his gaze flicked my way again. Not long, not obvious. Just enough that I felt it. I told myself I was imagining it. He was older, mid-40s maybe? And my best friend's uncle. Nothing about this weekend was supposed to involve him. But still, there was something in the way he carried himself, something in that silence that made me want to look back even when I shouldn't. At one point, Tyler cracked a joke and the whole room laughed. I laughed too loud, and when I glanced across the room, James was watching me. Not smiling, not frowning, just watching like he saw something the others didn't. It unsettled me, though not in a way that made me want to move. If anything, it left me curious, restless, wondering why I noticed him at all. Eventually, people drifted off toward their bunks, the fire burning low. I climbed into mine, the old wood frame creaking under my weight. Through the thin wall, I could hear muffled voices, then quiet. But my mind wasn't quiet. It replayed the way his eyes had lingered, the rough warmth of his handshake, the silence that seemed to stretch between us without either of us speaking. I turned on my side, staring at the shadows cast by the moon through the window. I didn't know what to make of the feeling in my chest. Not attraction, not yet, but awareness. Something unspoken had settled in the room when James walked in. And though I couldn't explain why, I knew the weekend wasn't going to stay the way I thought it would. Not after the way he looked at me. The morning came with the smell of coffee drifting through the cabin. I shuffled into the kitchen, still half asleep, hair sticking out in every direction. James was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug in his hand. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, like he hadn't spoken yet that day. "Morning," I replied, suddenly more awake than I should have been. The others trickled in, and soon breakfast was noisy. Hannah flipping pancakes, Tyler stealing bites before they were ready, Mark insisting we plan the day's hike. James didn't say much, but when he did, everyone seemed to quiet down, listening. We headed out after breakfast, the trail slick with dew. The group naturally split into pairs, laughing and racing ahead. I ended up walking slower, distracted by the way the sunlight cut through the trees. James fell into step beside me without asking. "You hike much?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "Mark's the one who loves this stuff. I'm more of a city person, I guess." He gave a small smile. "Wouldn't have guessed." "Why not?" "You notice things. People who rush don't notice." I didn't know how to respond to that. So I just walked, hyper-aware of how close his arms swung near mine every time our steps matched. By evening, the cabin was alive with the glow of the fireplace. Someone put on a movie, and the living room turned into a pile of blankets, pillows, and bodies. I hesitated when I saw the couch already half occupied, James sitting at one end, Hannah curled up on the floor with Mark, Tyler and Eric sprawling across cushions. The only space left was beside him. I sat down cautiously, making sure to leave just enough room so our legs wouldn't touch. But as the movie started and people shifted, that space closed without me meaning to. His arm stretched casually along the back of the couch, his sleeve brushing my shoulder. At first I tried to ignore it. But every time I leaned even slightly, the fabric of my shirt grazed his. And he didn't move away. Halfway through the movie, Hannah laughed too hard at something and knocked into me. My knee jerked, bumping against his leg. "Sorry," I whispered, flustered. James tilted his head toward me, his voice quiet but steady. "Don't be." He didn't pull his leg back. And neither did I. The screen flickered in front of us, shadows from the fire dancing along the walls. But I couldn't tell you what the movie was about. All I could focus on was the steady warmth radiating from the space between us, the way his shoulder brushed mine every time I breathed a little deeper. It was nothing, technically. Just a crowded couch, just accidental contact. But in the quiet of my own thoughts, I knew it didn't feel like nothing. The room eventually thinned out. Tyler went to grab snacks, Eric stretched and yawned, Hannah and Mark whispered their way upstairs. Suddenly it was just the two of us, the end credits rolling across the screen. I shifted, about to get up, but then his hand adjusted on the back of the couch, close enough that if I leaned back even slightly, it would be against him. I stayed where I was, heart in my throat. Finally he stood, stretching slowly, his shirt pulling against his shoulders. "Good movie," he said, though I could tell he hadn't been watching either. "Yeah," I managed, my voice a little rough. We both knew there was nothing unusual about sharing a couch. And yet, as I lay in my bunk later, staring at the ceiling, I kept replaying the way he hadn't moved away. It was too close to be nothing. And I couldn't stop wondering if he felt it too. Rain started sometime in the night. By morning it was steady, drumming against the cabin roof like a heartbeat. The trails were slick, so hiking was out. The living room filled instead with the smell of cocoa and the sound of board games being pulled from closets. We played for a while, laughter bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. But eventually, one by one, people drifted off, Tyler muttering about a nap, Eric scrolling through his phone in his bunk, Mark and Hannah disappearing into their room with the excuse of just resting. Which left me alone in the living room, half curled on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, listening to the storm outside. I didn't notice at first that James was still there. He sat across from me in the armchair, quiet, the firelight soft against his face. He wasn't doing anything, just watching the rain through the window. When our eyes met, I felt caught. Not like I'd been staring, but like he had been waiting. "You're quiet," he said finally, his voice low, carrying easily over the soft crackle of the fire. "I guess," I admitted. "I'm better at listening than filling space." He tilted his head, thoughtful. "Nothing wrong with that." His tone wasn't casual. It was steady, like he meant it, like he saw something in me and wanted me to believe it. I looked down at the book in my lap, though the words on the page blurred. My chest felt tighter than it should have. "Sometimes it makes people think I'm closed off. Or maybe," he said, leaning back slightly, "it makes you careful." That landed deeper than I expected. I glanced up again and his eyes were on me, not probing, not sharp, but steady, grounding. The silence stretched. I should have said something, anything, but the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full, like the room was humming with things neither of us had put into words. Outside, thunder rolled, low and long. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Instinctively, I looked toward him again. And he was already watching me. For a moment, it was as if the storm had faded away, the fire, the rain, the whole cabin. All of it reduced to the way his gaze held mine. I wanted to ask why he came up here. I wanted to ask what he saw when he looked at me like that. But I didn't. The questions pressed against the back of my throat, and yet I stayed quiet, afraid that if I spoke, the moment would break. Eventually, the sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped the spell. Eric shuffled back into the room, yawning, and the weight of the silence dissolved like mist. James shifted in his chair, turning his attention to the fire again as if nothing had happened. But something had. I felt it in the way my pulse still raced, in the way my thoughts replayed the quiet between us like a secret only I understood. That night, as rain continued against the windows and the others talked themselves to sleep, I lay awake thinking not about the storm, not about the trip, but about him, about the silence that somehow said more than words could. Something had shifted. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew it too. The storm finally cleared the next morning, leaving the world washed clean. By evening, the cabin had settled into its usual rhythm. Cards scattered across the table, snacks half-eaten, the fire humming low in the background. But I felt different. Ever since the rain, ever since that silence with James, I couldn't stop noticing him. The way he leaned back in the armchair, legs stretched out, watching the flames more than the game. The way his voice was quiet, but when he spoke, people listened. The way my eyes seemed drawn to him without permission. It was late when everyone started to drift off to bed. Mark and Hannah disappeared upstairs, Tyler and Eric arguing about who got the last cookie before finally calling it a night. I lingered, pretending to straighten up the table, though really I was waiting. When I turned toward the kitchen, James was already there. He was rinsing a glass at the sink, the dim overhead light casting shadows across his shoulders. I hesitated, then stepped in to grab water for myself. We stood side by side in the small kitchen, the cabin unusually quiet around us. My arm brushed his as I reached for the faucet. I froze, half expecting him to step back. But he didn't. Instead, as I filled my glass, his hand shifted. Not much. Just enough that his fingers rested lightly against my forearm. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't even a hold. Just a touch, soft, deliberate, lingering. I turned my head, startled, and found his eyes already on mine. For a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to narrow to that point of contact. The warmth of his skin against mine, the steady calm in his gaze. My pulse hammered, but I didn't move. I didn't want to. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for me to realize this wasn't accidental. Long enough for me to understand that he was giving me the choice to pull away, and I wasn't. Finally, he cleared his throat, almost too softly to hear, and let his hand fall back. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Good night." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Good night." He left the kitchen, his footsteps fading down the hall. I stood there long after he was gone, glass forgotten in my hand, skin still tingling where he had touched me. When I finally made it to my bunk, I lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling. My body replayed the moment on a loop, the warmth, the stillness, the unspoken electricity. It hadn't been a mistake. It couldn't have been. And yet, the next morning, he acted as though nothing had happened. He poured coffee, asked about the day's plans, laughed quietly at one of Mark's jokes. I matched his calm, but inside my thoughts wouldn't settle. Because no matter how normal he tried to make it seem, I knew. The touch had stayed. By the third night, the cabin had taken on a rhythm of its own. Meals, laughter, board games, hikes when the weather allowed. But beneath all of that, something quiet and unspoken thrummed between James and me. I caught myself seeking him out in small ways, choosing the chair closest to his at the table, lingering when he spoke even if it wasn't to me, watching his hands when he poured a drink or set a log onto the fire. And every now and then I swore I felt the same pull mirrored in him, the way his gaze would catch mine, then hold just a fraction too long before he looked away. That night, the others went to bed early, leaving the fire crackling low and the living room dim. I stayed on the couch, pretending to be absorbed in the dying flames. James didn't move either. He leaned forward in the armchair, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the embers as if the fire might answer something he hadn't asked out loud. The silence grew heavy, pressing on me until I couldn't take it anymore. "I keep thinking," I said quietly, almost surprising myself with the sound of my own voice, "that this feels like something." He looked up. His eyes found mine across the firelight, steady and unreadable. For a long moment he didn't respond. The silence stretched, filled with the pop of wood splitting in the flames. Then finally his voice came low and certain. "It doesn't feel like nothing." The words landed hard, like a truth I'd been waiting for but afraid to admit. My chest tightened, heat spreading through me that had nothing to do with the fire. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "So, what do we do with that?" James leaned back slowly, exhaling. He didn't look away. "Maybe we don't have to decide tonight." His calm steadied me, but it didn't make the feelings go away. If anything, they surged stronger, knowing he had named it, even in the smallest way. The fire popped again, sparks drifting upward. I glanced down, unsure what to do with my hands. They rested uselessly on the couch cushion beside me. That's when I felt it, his fingers brushing against mine. Just the faintest touch, feather light, almost as if he was testing whether I'd notice. I did. I froze, every nerve lit up, but I didn't pull away. Slowly, deliberately, I let my little finger shift until it rested against his. The contact was nothing more than two hands barely touching. But to me, it was everything. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, saying nothing, just breathing in the same quiet space, holding on to a connection neither of us had planned. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a confession shouted into the night. But it was enough to make me realize that maybe, just maybe, this was real. And the thought terrified me as much as it thrilled me. The morning after that quiet exchange by the fire, everything felt different, though nothing on the surface had changed. The cabin was just as noisy with Mark's chatter, just as filled with the smell of coffee and pancakes, just as cluttered with backpacks and damp hiking boots. But I felt it, the difference. A thread between James and me that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there, waiting to be pulled. We didn't speak of it. Not with words. But our silences felt fuller, like we both knew exactly what hadn't been said. That afternoon, Mark suggested splitting firewood to restock the pile outside. Everyone groaned, but somehow, it ended up being me and James who carried the axe and trudged out to the stack near the tree line. The air was cool and crisp, heavy with the scent of pine. I tried and failed to split one of the logs cleanly, the axe sticking awkwardly halfway down. James chuckled, shaking his head as he walked over. "Here," he said, pulling the handle from my grip with ease. "Let me show you." I stood back, watching the way he planted his feet, the easy strength in the motion as the axe came down, splitting the wood clean in two. "Like that?" he said simply. "Yeah, well," I muttered, smiling despite myself, "some of us weren't born lumberjacks." That earned me a grin, small but real. "No. But you're teachable." I rolled my eyes, but the warmth in his tone lingered. We fell into a rhythm then, him splitting, me stacking, and the work became almost easy. Between the sound of wood cracking and the crisp air filling my lungs, it felt peaceful. At one point I caught him watching me. Not in the casual way you glance at someone beside you, but in that steady, unguarded way that made me want to look back. I laughed, brushing sawdust from my jacket. "What?" I asked. He shook his head, the corners of his mouth softening. "Nothing. Just, you laugh like you mean it." The comment was simple, but it hit somewhere deep, leaving me strangely breathless. I looked away, stacking another log just to keep my hands busy. Later, when we carried the wood back to the cabin, our hands brushed as we passed each other through the doorway. This time, neither of us pretended it didn't happen. I felt his fingers graze mine, intentional, light, lingering, and though it was barely a second, it sent something warm all through me. That evening, after everyone else drifted off to their bunks, we found ourselves alone again by the fire. No words at first. Just the soft crackle, the shadows on the walls, the closeness I was beginning to crave. I sat cross-legged on the couch, my shoulder brushing his arm. He didn't move. In fact, after a moment he leaned just slightly, enough that the contact became steady, solid. My breath caught. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I just let myself feel it. And then, slowly he shifted closer, his presence warm beside me. I thought maybe he'd say something, but instead, he lowered his head just enough that his lips brushed my temple. It was so soft, so careful that I almost wondered if I imagined it. But no, it was real. A touch that wasn't asking or taking or rushing. A touch that gave. I closed my eyes, every thought in my head dissolving into that one quiet moment. My chest ached in a way I didn't have words for, like something inside me had been waiting for this without me ever realizing it. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just sat there, shoulder to shoulder, his breath steady near my ear, the firelight painting the room in gold. And I thought, with a clarity that startled me, I didn't know I was waiting for this. But I was. And I didn't want it to end. Morning came too soon. The last day at the cabin always carried a certain chaos. The scraping of chairs against the floor, the shuffle of bags being packed, the smell of coffee stronger than usual to push us through. The weekend had blurred by in a haze of laughter, rainstorms, and unspoken things. Now all at once it was ending. I moved through it like I was half there. Helping Tyler find his missing sweatshirt, stacking empty mugs by the sink, stuffing my own clothes into a backpack. Around me voices rose and fell, familiar and careless. But under it all was a quiet awareness. Time was running out. James was there too, moving steadily among us, carrying his small duffel bag to the door, offering to load the car. He didn't look at me much, but every time our eyes brushed, I felt it, that same thread between us, pulled tighter by the knowledge that soon it would stretch into distance. When the last box of groceries was carried outside, I stepped onto the porch for air. The woods stretched wide and green in the early light, mist curling between the trees. My breath clouded faintly in the chill, the boards cool beneath my socks. I heard the door creak behind me and knew before I turned that it was him. "You ready?" James asked quietly. "Almost," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine, steadier than I felt. He came to stand beside me, his duffel slung over one shoulder. For a moment we just stood there, looking at the forest, listening to the faint clatter of the others inside. "I wasn't sure I'd even come this weekend," he said finally. I glanced at him, surprised. What made you change your mind? He let out a breath that could have been a laugh, though it wasn't quite. Not sure. Just felt like I should. His eyes shifted toward me then, steady, holding mine in that way that always seemed to cut through everything else. The porch boards creaked beneath us as I shifted my weight. My throat felt dry, but I forced the words out anyway. I'm glad you did. For a moment, his expression softened, enough that I saw something unguarded flicker there. He reached out then, almost without thinking, and his hand caught my arm lightly, just above the wrist. The touch was steady, grounding, quiet. You take care of yourself, he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a promise or a confession or anything that could be boxed neatly into words. But the way he said it, low, certain, made my chest ache. I nodded. You too. His fingers lingered for a beat longer than they needed to before letting go. He didn't move away right away though. We stood there, close enough to feel the heat of him, the silence wrapping around us like it had that first stormy afternoon. Then the door opened behind us, Mark's voice booming, ready to roll? The moment broke. James gave me a final, almost imperceptible squeeze of my arm before stepping back, adjusting the strap of his bag. We piled into the cars soon after. The drive back was filled with music, chatter, Tyler's bad jokes. I laughed in the right places, nodded when someone asked me something, but my mind was elsewhere. Out the window, the trees blurred past, golden with early autumn light. And somewhere in that blur, I thought of him, of the way his eyes had found mine across firelight, the way his hand had rested on my arm in the kitchen, the way his lips had pressed softly against my temple as though giving me something I didn't know I'd been missing. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. It didn't matter. Because what had happened in that cabin, quiet and unexpected, was already mine to carry. I leaned my head against the window, closing my eyes against the sunlight. I didn't expect it. I didn't ask for it. But I wouldn't undo it for anything. Whatever this becomes, it's already part of me.